are listening to the Thornapple Valley Church podcast. Thank you for joining us. Our hope is for you to be encouraged and to connect with God during this message. If you'd like to know more about Thornapple Valley Church, visit tvcweb.com.
You know, as we enter into 2023, here's what I know. For some of us, we have a hard time saying yes to our New Year's resolutions because we have a hard time saying goodbye to some of our regrets. I'm talking about that moment where last year you were so excited and you said, this is going to be my year. This is going to be the year that I lose the weight, I drop the debt, that I start moving forward, and you signed up for a gym and you bought a treadmill, you bought a Peloton. And now that Peloton is a coat wreck and somebody talk to me in Delton and Middleville. You know what I'm talking about. We've all had those moments where we say, we're going to do it. And then we tried. And then this happened and that happened. And for some of us right now, we feel pretty hopeless because regret is real. And for a lot of us, what we're trying to figure out is, what do I do with the regrets that I have? Because if I ignore them, it doesn't make them go away. You know, recently a pastor friend of mine was getting prepared to preach on the subject of regret in his church, and he couldn't think of any regrets of his own, so he texted his wife. Does anybody understand where this is going? And she immediately started to text him back some regrets that she thought that he should have. So the first one, she said, hey, remember that time where we were new into our date relationship and you tried to look spiritual, so you grabbed my hand to pray. And he said, Lord, thank God for Peggy, your ex-girlfriend. Do you remember that? Do you regret that? And then she said, what about that time where you were trying to be pastoral, you go to the hospital to visit a guy who just had weight reduction surgery, and you looked at him and said, man, that took a lot of guts. Do you regret that? And I have to tell you, as I listened to that guy, I felt a little bit better about my regrets, because I thought about one of my own, and I actually really battled with if I would even share this regret because I'm so embarrassed about it. But you guys know how you're never supposed to ask a woman if she's pregnant? Do I have to finish this story? Because, oh my gosh, I'll never forget doing that one time and just thinking, if I could have those words back, and it was just, it's bad. But here's the truth when it comes to regret. There's some that we can laugh about, but there's some that are too painful and too present to laugh about. And that's why for many of us, this is one of those series where you know that you need it, but you don't want to hear it because we all have regrets. There used to be a website called mysecretregrets.com. And on that website, what people would do is they would post publicly and anonymously regrets that they would never say out loud. Here's what one lady said. I regret marrying my husband just 3 weeks ago. I should have called it off before walking down the aisle. I am 23 and I just haven't had time to learn to love myself yet. I just imagine the pain of this lady who I imagine that she went back and forth and there were warning signs and there was questions, and then all of a sudden she said, I do, and then in the middle of it, somewhere along the way, 3 weeks in, she thought, I don't. Some of us get this. We remember the very first fight that turned into the second fight, the third fight, the fourth fight, and some of us in our marriage, we haven't stopped fighting since that first fight. Here's what another lady said, or person said, one of my greatest regrets is screaming in frustration at my mom who has dementia because she wouldn't let me help her and give her support. I lived 7 hours away. She was so upset and confused. And then this person goes on to say, I am an awful human being. I was trying to be helpful, but somewhere along the way in my desire to be helpful, I ended up realizing that I was doing more hurting than helping. And what does that make me? And then finally, this one person said this. My biggest regret happened 31 years ago when I worked as a salesman at a local department store. I gave a friend merchandise he didn't pay for, and I was later charged with a crime because of it. I have a criminal record that has prevented me from getting a good job. I'm now in my 50s, and I think about all the things I could have done if I hadn't made such a dumb mistake. You know, mysecretregrets.com could be filled with all of our stories. I wish I never would have gone to that party. I wish I would have never met that person. I wish I never would have tried that for the first time and it became an addiction that now is an issue. That if I could go back, start over again, I would. Most of us are trying to figure out how to do this. So I want to talk to you about the top 3 regrets that most of us have to deal with. Actually, I think all of us have to deal with. And the first one I want to look at is, if you got a Bible, go to Matthew chapter 27. In Matthew chapter 27, we're going to read the story of a man who finds himself in a situation where his issue became a problem, and it became a snare, and eventually it became a regret. See, I don't know about you, but I never set out to have regrets. Oftentimes, it's the unaddressed issues in my life that cause me to, at some moment and at some time, to do something that I'm not proud of or not do something that I should do. That's what's going on in the life of this man. So in Matthew chapter 27, here's what we're going to read about this man. In Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 1, it says, "Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans on how to execute Jesus. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor." So this is after Jesus has had his 3 trials by the Jews. Now he's going into the second phase of his trials, the 3 that he's going to undergo by the Romans. Verse 3, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse. He didn't just have regret. Regret had him. See, if you were reading this in the original language, in Greek language, this is what's in what's called the middle voice, which means that regret was not just a decision that Judas made, it was something that had a hold of him. Seized with remorse. Here's what he's going to do. He returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." Here's what I'm talking about an issue that becomes a problem that eventually becomes a regret. Here's what I think was always true of Judas is he had a problem with greed. And I imagine the very first time he steals from Jesus and he gets away with it, if Judas was living to this day, he would say, "I wish I never would have got away with it. Because when I got away with it, I thought it was okay. I justified it in my mind. What I said to myself is, I'm a little down on my luck. I will pay it back." And then I got away with it a second time and a third time. And then all of a sudden, I was living a double life. I was ripping off Jesus. And then there comes a moment where I get the opportunity to make 30 pieces of silver. Now, 30 pieces of silver during our day and time, if we were in the same kind of culture, it would be equivalent to about $3,000. So he's been taking 10, 15, 20. Now he's got a moment to make $3,000. All he's got to do is betray Jesus. All he's got to do is give up Jesus' location. So he gets approached. And I imagine now that conscience that he used to have is no longer talking to him, or it's been turned off. So he goes through with it. And I imagine every moment, he's feeling kind of shaky and nervous that he's going to get caught up and found out, but he does it. He gets away with it. He's got the money, and then comes the morning. I've noticed in my own life, regret always happens early in the morning, not late at night. It's when you wake up at the party. It's when you wake up and you think to yourself, What did I do? Why did I do it? And now in a moment of frustration, he takes the money and says, I don't want this anymore. Because he sees his actions. Jesus is being led away. And Judas thinks to himself, I did that. I did that. See, the first type of regret every one of us has to deal with is regrets of action. It's the stuff that we did. And honestly, in layman's terms, I call it the stuff that I did that I wish I wouldn't have. For some of you teenagers, I wish I would have never went to that party. I wish I would have never lied to my parents. Regrets of action. Here's the kind of way I illustrate it is the regrets of action kind of look like this. If it was a piece of board, the regrets of action kind of smack us in the forehead. They seize us, they hit us, and we think to us, can't believe I did that. It's the relationships that we ruin. It's the money that we mismanaged. And we're reminded of our regrets of action for those of us who have not been diligent with our money. Every time we go to apply for something for credit and we get denied. It's the rage that we have unleashed. How many of you parents would tell the truth, shame the devil? How many of you have ever punished the wrong child? You know what I'm talking about? And in that moment, we feel embarrassed, but it's hard to humble ourselves and we think, man, regrets of action. But if you stay with me in the book of Matthew, I want you to go back a few chapters to Matthew chapter 19. Because we're going to meet another young man who's going to make a different choice that's going to lead to a different type of regret. In Matthew chapter 19, here's what we're going to read. Matthew 19, I'm going to start in verse 20. But before I read that, let me set up the story of what's happening here. So Jesus has been traveling around. Everywhere Jesus goes, he gets a crowd. Everywhere Jesus goes, he has something powerful to say. And Jesus is calling people to be his disciple, to follow him, to be on his team. And so then comes a guy who the Bible says he's rich, he's young, and he's a ruler. If that dude had a Christian Mingle profile, that's baby daddy material if you know what I'm talking about. This guy, he's rich, he's young, and he's a ruler. But he comes to Jesus, and here's what he says to Jesus. He says, Jesus, how can I have eternal life? And Jesus says to him, well, do what the commandments say. Here's what he says in verse 20. All these I've kept, the young man said, what do I still lack? See, he says, I'm a good person already. Go to church, stand up, sit down, do what's right, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. I got that. I've got money, I've got success. Every time I look at Forbes magazine, I see my picture, and the very first time I saw it, I was impressed with myself, but now, just another picture. Every time I hit a goal, I said by 30 I would make this amount, by 40 I would make this amount, and now I've already achieved all those goals, but there's still something missing. There's got to be more to life than just achieving and making money and then getting to a point where people want to be near me, but not because of who I am, but because what I got. What do I still lack? Here's what I know, that there's some people watching me online in Middleville and Delton here at the Hastings campus, and this is your question right now. What do I still lack? Because really, honestly, you might say, I'm not rich and I don't have this big house, but I got a lot of the things that I set out to achieve, but I'm lacking something. So here's what Jesus says to him. Verse 21. If you want to be perfect, if you want to be mature in Greek, that's the word. Go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and then you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. Let me answer the question. If you really want what you're missing, live for a bigger purpose. Instead of living to achieve, live for a life that will outlive you. But here's what the man does in verse 22. says, when the young man heard this, he went away. And what is that word? Sad. Because he had great wealth. But my question is, did he have great wealth, or did great wealth have his heart? He went away sad. Why did he go away sad? Because he knew what Jesus said was true. He knew that the moment he would say, I'm done with it, I'm done with all the achievement, the very question he's asking, Jesus answers, and because he knows that's the right answer, he goes away sad. You know, this is not going to come up on the screen, but this is what I wrote down in my notes, is that greed will steal your guts. Greed will make you a less courageous person. That's what it did for Judas. It made him less courageous. The courageous thing is to be content with what you have, to be disciplined, and to get there over time. But he saw a shortcut, and it stole his courage to stand up and be the man that he should have been. For this young man, the same thing happens. His wealth, his status had him. He was locked all into that. And what he's going to show us is the second type of regret most of us have, if not all of us have, is regrets of inaction. Regrets of inaction. It's not the stuff that I did, but the stuff that I wish I would have done. Right? The apology that I wish I would have made. The opportunity I just wish I would have stepped into it. I wish I would have not allowed my insecurity to hold me back from going after what God ultimately called me to. What if I failed? Well, what if I succeeded? He went away sad. Another nameless, faithless, rich, young ruler. That's all we know him as. Peter, James, and John. If you're a Christ follower, if you read the Bible, you're familiar with those people, and those are people who did do the very thing that Jesus called them to do, to trust him in a major way. Regrets of inaction. You know, if regrets of action kind of smack us in the forehead, regrets of inaction kind of hit us in the back of the head. They kick in later, and we think to ourselves, man, where would my life have been if I would have taken the risk? Where would my life have been if I would have said yes instead of saying no to God, to him, to her, to my future? You know, there is a book called the Book of Common Prayers from the 16th century. And in that book, it was a book to teach common people how to pray, which is why it's called the Book of Common Prayers. There's a prayer in there that goes like this: O merciful God, forgive us, for we have sinned against thee in word, thought, and deed, in what we have done and what we've left undone. Forgive us, God, for the stuff that we didn't do, that we should have done. But then here's the last form of regret. And this is the more difficult one to talk about, is regrets of reaction. This is, we regret the stuff that happened to us. I regret the stuff that I did, and I regret the stuff that I didn't do. But what I really regret is how certain experiences of my life have shaped me. The person who illustrates this for us is a guy in the Bible by the name of Job. If you got a Bible, go to Job chapter 3. Because in Job chapter 3, Job is going to pray one of the most PG-13 prayers in the Bible. He's going to get honest. He's going to get raw. He doesn't address God, oh God, merciful God who's good and who's faithful and who's kind. In pain, he prays honestly and from a place of brokenness and confusion. Here's what he says. He says, after this, talking about a painful time in his life where Joseph loses his wealth, his health, and all of his kids. Says Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, may the day of my birth perish, the night that conceived and a boy, and the night that it said a boy is conceived. So what Job is saying is that day that my parents went to the ultrasound and the lady said, the ultrasound says, hey, you got a baby boy. He says, I hate that day. Because I never knew what was coming. The sadness, the heartbreak. Hate that day. He goes on to say this. Says, that day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. No gloom. May gloom and utter darkness claim it. Job is saying, man, if somebody would have told me that life was going to get this hard, that I was going to experience this, my life's not even worth living. Now, here's the thing about Job. Job is a man, if you read his story, who I would assume has very little regrets. And here's why I believe that is because when you read Job chapter 1, verse 3, the Bible says he was blameless, he was upright, he feared God, and he shunned evil. Blameless, upright, feared God, shunned evil. Blameless, upright. He was careful, he was cautious. He was a good businessman. He loved his wife. He loved his kids. He was caring. He was kind. And then life happened. And for some of us, this is why we're having a hard time with God right now. Because a God that we thought was good allowed something really bad to happen in our life. And we regret that it happened, and we really regret that God let it happen. For Job, he's going to spend the rest of the book asking God this question and making this statement. God, why? And it's not fair. God, why? And it is not fair what I'm walking through. He's going to ask God that question many different ways. But then in Job chapter 38, God's going to show up. And God's going to ask Job between 77 to 103 different questions that leads Job to one conclusion. In Job chapter 42, here's what we read. This is Job's response to God showing up. It says, then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be thwarted. See, Job is in the midst of pain. He's in the midst of regret. And the regret's got him stuck. See, if you go through enough hard stuff, you lose your zest for life. You lose your desire to get excited. Everybody go, oh, man, you got to come back to church. Man, they got free Starbucks coffee. And you're like, yeah, whatever. Pastor Keith lost 35 pounds last year. It's awesome, which is actually a true statement. But anyway, I'm not even sure why I said that. That has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. But anyway, stick to your notes, Keith. But here's the point. For Job, he's in a dark place, but then he has an encounter with God. Here's what I wanted to just say to somebody who came to church in a dark place. This is the best time for you to meet God. Because it's when you have your preconceptions of God all messed up that God actually shows up. And here's what Job is going to show us and demonstrate to us is that God's going to help Job to start over by, number one, revealing to him a higher purpose. Higher purpose. Job says, now I realize that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Because here's what Job believed. That if I was good enough, I could stop all the bad from happening to me. So Job had a subtle belief that we all feel, especially if you become wildly successful. Now, some of us never really achieve a whole lot in life, and so we don't kind of believe that we deserve a lot of things. But there's some of us who've been really, really successful in life, in business, in relationships, and we have this belief, I got here by myself. Job had a subtle belief that he was in control of everything. And when everything comes out of his control, he realizes that there's a God who's good, who's higher, and can be trusted. Here's the purpose that I think God's going to reveal to Job. And it's threefold. It's not going to come up on the screen, but if you're writing down, here's the threefold higher purpose that God's going to reveal to Job. Number one is God's going to teach Job how to be humble. You don't know how prideful you are until you get humbled. How to be humble. And here's what humility is about. It's recognizing that there's a God who's higher, who's bigger, who has more understanding than me. And when I look at things, I can only see part of the story. He sees the big picture. And here's what humility does. It brings peace to your life. Because you have a part to play, but you're not totally in control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best. I'm going to trust God to do the rest, and I'm going to be okay with life. What humility is about, it's recognizing our actual state before God. God's purpose was for him to be humble, but here's the second purpose that God has for Job that he reveals to him, that he has for all of us, our lives. Is the second higher purpose that God's going to reveal to Job is to be humble. Or I'm sorry, not to be humble, but to be holy. God's purpose was to make him better. In the hardship, what's inside of Job starts to come out, and Job is going to repent. He's going to change directions. And God's going to help him to get better. Now, I was making a joke about losing a bunch of weight last year, but that actually really does have a part to what I'm talking about. So, the year before last, I was in this interesting place where I had a lot of stuff going on personally and just a lot going on. So I started eating a lot and overeating and different things like that. And I'll never forget, I get to a moment last year around Christmas time where everything that I was running from, it kind of bubbled up to the surface. Not last year, but like the year before last year. And I found myself in the ER, high blood pressure, just in this really, really terrible place. And it was in that moment, even though there was nothing like physically detrimental going on to me, I was able to look myself in the face and realize all the stuff I was running from. And it was that day that I started making different choices to face some of that stuff. And I have to tell you that changing is not like about weight. It was about facing what I was running from. And what I've seen is in the midst of hard times in your life, you have an opportunity to face some of that stuff. And a lot of people would say, the hard stuff allowed me to get better because I faced some stuff. Here's the last thing about that higher purpose that God's going to reveal to Job is God's going to give him a heart for the hurting. See, when you go through hard stuff, it develops your compassion. If you lack compassion, then what I would say is there's a couple reasons that could be. It might mean that you have a hard heart, but it might mean that life has not gotten very hard for you. Because I'm telling you, when you go through some stuff, if you've ever had an addiction, it's a lot easier for you to have grace and compassion on somebody who had an addiction. When you go through hard stuff, it changes the way you respond to other people. And so Job changes. But then here's the second thing that's going to happen for him. In Job chapter 42, in verse 10, it says this: after Job prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him at his house. They comforted him and consoled him over all the trouble that the Lord had brought on him. Each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. Here's the power of Job's story, is that it's not about the beginning, it's about the end. The power of Job's story is he got better. But here's what I want you to notice. In verse 10, it says, after he prayed for his friend, the Lord restored his fortunes. The question is, did God bless him or did people bless him? And the answer is yes. See, here's what often happens, especially if we do not like being and feeling vulnerable, is we push others away. But for Job, in this moment, when he gets his relationship right with God, he gets his relationship right with other people, he allows other people to help him. Let me look you in the eye and just tell you something. You need help. I need help. And that's why we do tribes around here. Because what tribes are is not the most spiritual people and they get together and they act all spiritual together. What it is it's people who get together and say, man, I can help you and you can help me, and together we'll get better. See, God helped Job to start over by deepening his relationships. When he deepened those relationships, people blessed them. And then here's the last thing that he's going to do. Is God's going to show him a new opportunity. See, each person gives him a piece of silver and gold, and then Job turns that into something new. But let me tell you something. When you're in a dark place and when regret is controlling your life, you live your life like this, looking backwards. You're missing opportunities that are in front of you because you're looking backwards. But when you start to look forward, you start to understand that life is a series of next steps. That's a blessing. I can be thankful for that. And I'm going to take one step at a time, until I get towards what God ultimately has for me.
Thank you for listening to the Thornapple Valley Church podcast. If you found this message encouraging, we invite you to share it. For more information, visit tbcweb.org.